And good evening, depending on where you're connecting from. To introduce myself, my name is Manjunath Agali. I'm part of Citrix Ready team leading the desktop ecosystem. I'm your host for today's webinar, and today we have PernixData with us. Thank you for attending the webinar today, and I would like to welcome you all to the Citrix Ready technical webinar series, where we showcase how Citrix and our partners have integrated to deliver valuable products and solutions to common problems faced by our partners. Presenting today, we have Andy Daniel, Solutions Architect from PernixData, and also we have Nick Casagrande, IT Director from Southern West Systems. Next slide, please. To introduce Citrix Ready, Citrix Ready is an end-to-end technology partner program that showcases and recommends third-party products, solutions, and services that demonstrate compatibility with Citrix products. Customers can quickly and easily find solutions recommended by Citrix in the Citrix Ready marketplace by navigating to citrixready.com/ready. For more information on the Citrix Ready program, you can navigate to citrix.com/partnerprogram/citrixready. A brief introduction about PernixData. PernixData is established in the year 2012. PernixData has more than 150 employees. PernixData have been Citrix Ready partner since 2014. Today, we are going to learn how a decoupled storage architecture can strengthen your existing infrastructure to reduce the VDI latency by more than 80% and to deliver 60 times more IOPS, and how to leverage the existing infrastructure. So before we start the presentation, if you have any questions during the webinar, please use the question and answer question panel on the right-hand side, and we take your questions in the question and answer session. So without any further delay, please welcome our first speaker, Andy Daniel, Solutions Architect from PernixData.
Thanks, Mark.
Andy.
I appreciate it.
Over to you.
Thank you very much. So since our audience may not be very familiar with PernixData today, we thought before we kind of dive into the Citrix specifics, we might go into a little bit of background, a little bit more about PernixData and our solution called FBP. So as you can see from the slide here, our mission really is to lead a new era of server-side storage intelligence, right? So what we're actually going to do is place storage intelligence into local high-speed media, but do that in an environment without changing it. Let's say, for example, a Citrix environment running on top of VMware as a good example, right? So what we aim to do is actually use server-side resources without changing an existing setup where an existing array is serving performance and capacity. On the back end, we can actually help that performance, make it much faster, and deliver much lower latency to desktop users. And not only that, not just desktops, but actually servers in the environment as well. So the main tenet, if you don't take anything away from the webinar today, one of the things I want you to really remember is the fact that our main goal really is to decouple storage performance from storage capacity. And so as we'll actually see as we kind of go through the presentation, this becomes very applicable to Citrix environments. So just as a quick quality check, Nick, did we get you on the line today, or are you here? Nick Casagrande, Southern Waste, and proud, I believe proud, PernixData FBP customer. Are you here, Nick?
Yes, Andy, I'm here.
Fantastic, fantastic. We had some technical issues getting Nick on today. If we have time, we may go more into that, and maybe some way PernixData could fix those for him. So just quickly, when I start to talk about decoupling storage performance from capacity, what does that really mean? And so to us, we really see FBP, our product, as a strategic infrastructure platform. So you can see from the slide here, what we really aim to do is move I/O close to actual virtual machines. So in the case of Citrix, what this is going to mean is actually running, XenDesktop as an example on top of VMware. So our product actually plugs right into the actual hypervisor within VMware, making it completely seamless. So what we're able to do is actually scale out performance continually as we continue to add more servers and those server-side resources. And what we do in that case is every time we add one, we actually aggregate any either server-side RAM or server-side flash actually into a, we'll say, a pool or a cluster of resources. So what that actually means in this case is that we can do that without actually making any changes to the existing environment. And that's really a key for FTP, right? The fact that you won't change anything about your actual Citrix deployment, right? So if you're running XenDesktop as an example today, you won't actually change anything about the way you actually deploy your desktops or anything like that. Will actually integrate directly in the VM kernel and intercept I/O at that layer, so that it's actually you're not making any changes to your environment. And what that means in this case is that we're easily able to scale out storage performance, again, decoupled from capacity. So again, that's a real important factor here, right? So on the back end, we can continue to leverage data services and capacity from our storage layer, right? But we can actually scale performance, and in this case, let's just say, for example, IOPS, as we continue to add additional either resources in the servers, or when we continue to add additional servers to run more desktops, right? So what that means is that scale out now becomes very linear and cost effective, right? So every server that I add to the environment, I can expect a linear gain in actual storage performance for that. So what does that really mean for VDI, right? We're kind of jumping into kind of the nuts and bolts of today's webinar, right? How does that really apply to Citrix in this environment? And so I'm actually going to invite Nick, definitely Nick, as we kind of go through this environment or through the slides here, definitely interject as you feel necessary to kind of talk about your environment. One of the things that we've talked about, and you've probably heard at length, and hopefully if you're using Citrix already, maybe it's one of those things you've seen in your environment, and that's the fact that just traditional storage can't keep up with VDI, right? It tends to be very write-heavy, random, right? Variable. We see boot storms, login storms, right? Antivirus scans, patches, and those are some of the things you were experiencing, I think, in your environment as well, right, Nick?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Yeah, absolutely, Andy. So, one of the things that, VMware, first recommends when you start going down the VDI path is that you have a completely separate cluster to manage your VDI infrastructure. So, they want a separate host, they want separate storage, separate networking, et cetera, et cetera. But, in the case of me, I don't have that kind of money to go spin up an entire new cluster with all dedicated resources just for VDI. So what we were seeing was very heavy, write I/O by the VDI machines, to where sometimes users would get, write latency of upwards of 500 milliseconds. And we basically got to the point before we, found out with Pernix existed, that we were kind of like, hey, don't run like SQL queries during the day, or hey, don't do a machine catalog update during the day. Don't schedule antivirus scans during the day. We were kind of like starting to re-architect our environment so that our VDI users didn't have the type of latency they did. So, if you're still trying to run everything on, a simple cluster and not have to go to multiple clusters to run your VDI, that's really where Pernix shines.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think you guys, correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, you've been a kind of a long time, XenDesktop user, correct? I mean, I think it's one of those things that, you guys really liked and worked really well in the environment, but just unfortunately kind of hamstrung the storage a bit over time as you added users, right?
Absolutely, yeah. We've been with XenDesktop since version 4/version 5, right on the cusp. So we've kind of been doing this a lot longer than some other people in the market. So today we can simulate workloads using login VSI and other tools to see how much VDI sessions we can pack onto a particular host or a particular storage array, a LUN, et cetera, et cetera. When I started doing this back 5, 6, 7 years ago, there were none of these tools. So we would literally have to try to watch vSphere graphs in as near real time as we could in 20-second increments to see where the spikes were and what possibly VMs were causing that. We didn't have a way to really smooth out the environment when it came to our storage needs to say, hey, what VM is being chatty? Which one's consuming I/O? Can we move it to a different LUN? It was almost like, shooting in the dark, per se.
Yeah, sure, yeah. And that's actually one of the neat things that we'll kind of talk about today is maybe how to use some of those new tools that, unfortunately, you didn't have available to you at the time. and so we can kind of talk about that and some of the performance we saw. So, I kind of immediately jumped in and we started talking about, accelerating and decoupling performance from capacity, that kind of thing. And we talked about, being able to use, flash technology and RAM even in our case as well. But, honestly, quite frankly, Flash has been around for a little bit of time, and it's not some new innovation from PernixData in this case, right? It's very well used throughout the market, but the real question is, where do we kind of put it, right? And how do we use it the most efficiently, right? And so as we kind of look across where we kind of drop that Flash in and have it sort of come to our rescue, we run into some issues, right, in each of the places where we may place it. And what it really comes down to is that we see, the best performance from Flash because of app proximity, right, actually in the server rather than, in a storage array, for example, right, where it can, be segregated onto its own pool, that kind of thing. Or frankly, maybe we run into controller scale as we continue to add Flash, that kind of thing. The great thing about actually putting it in the server is that as we continue to add additional Flash and servers, right, we're adding CPU to actually, again, scale linearly with that each time. So we're doing it at the compute layer. And then, kind of along, hyper-converged solutions have come along as well, right, to kind of solve this. And they work relatively well. But the thing I think, I really sort of struggled when looking at some of these solutions even before I came to PernixData was is the fact that, in many ways you're kind of paying storage prices for servers, right, when things are all combined into one. I'm curious, Nick, did you guys look at any, sort of Flash alternatives before you came across FPP?
Yeah, we actually did. We looked at some software-based solutions, and the software-based solutions, a lot of them just did the read cache only. So we've been doing read caching for, forever in IT. So Windows does some caching, natively with its processes. Your storage array controllers will do some read caching as well. So read caching is kind of easy. We've gotten really good at that over the years in IT. When it comes to VDI, though, we quickly realized that VDI wasn't a read-intensive thing. It was a write-intensive thing. So that's where we really needed something like Pernix to come to the rescue. And when you start looking at other solutions, such as the software-based solutions, I'm not going to mention any names. However, there are quite a number of those solutions on the market, but they do require you to install in-guest OS drivers. So you are going to have to modify your gold image and run through some routines and get that driver accustomed to your gold image. When it came to the case of XenDesktop with dealing with 100 VMs, as I know, as many VDI administrators do, anytime you make a change to that gold image, if you don't thoroughly regression test it to see if it's going to break other applications, you're putting yourself at risk to affect, anywhere from 1 to, a couple hundred users, depending on how big your pool is. So I, myself, am extremely cautious with what I do to my gold image each and every single day. So when it came to looking at those other solutions, I didn't want to modify my gold image. I didn't want to put any software in the guest OS. Whereas Pernix kind of fit in naturally, there was absolutely zero changes to your gold image, your XenDesktop configuration, your pools, your machine catalogs, absolutely nothing, zero. So, that's really where it fit in for us.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's exactly right. I think up front, I talked a little bit about sort of doing it in a seamless way without actually making any changes, but, I don't know that I really sort of emphasized that enough, right? I think that's definitely, one of the keys here, right? I think even when you guys went to implement, FPP, again, not having to make any changes is really a compelling thing, not just in the guest, but every other part of the infrastructure. That's the beautiful thing about sort of integrating in the actual hypervisor layer here with FPP is again, you're not going to make any of those changes. Continue to work as usual, just make things faster, right?
Yeah, absolutely. When you start looking at the whole hyper-converged market with EvoRail and the other players in the market, I mean, it's you're really talking about a major infrastructure upgrade there. And as you said, Andy, most of the times you have to buy compute in order to get storage, which you may not necessarily need. So you could quite possibly be throwing good dollars after bad dollars.
No, I couldn't have said it better myself. You're exactly right in that case. So. I think, to kind of get back on track directly with why we're here today and sort of talking about Citrix and FPP and that kind of thing, I want to kind of take people a little bit deeper kind of into our actual Citrix Ready certification process and tell you a little bit about that. Now, as you can see here on the slide, we are certified for XenF and XenDesktop. That's actually, very important thing for us. One of the things we set out to do very quickly and get on board. Certainly, as we saw, customers like you, Nick, really be able to leverage FPP with Citrix. So it's very important to us. So we definitely got on board with that process, and folks can definitely go out and take a look at the Citrix Ready site and learn more about FPP and how we integrate that kind of thing. But I'll take you through a little bit of kind of what we did as part of that certification process. And Nick, you mentioned earlier, right, that tools like Login VSI weren't available when you guys got started with XenDesktop. Unfortunately, fortunately for me, as part of the certification process, those tools are out there, right, and they're available. And again, we'll talk, kind of exclusively about Login VSI today, just because we found it to be such a powerful tool. And what it really does is it allows you to actually load up your systems, right? And the neat thing about it is that you can actually take your desktops, with Office apps, that kind of thing, as an example, right, and actually execute those. Right, and actually make changes, tune different things in the environment, that kind of thing, and actually see what that means to sort of that end user capacity, right? And so that capacity, in the case of Login VSI, is actually measured in a term they call VSI max, right? So that VSI max will be a value that's outputted to actually tell you. And then, certainly, hit up the Login VSI page, or better yet, you can always take a look at some of our reference architectures and that kind of thing. We'll tell you a little bit more about how that's calculated. But it has a lot to do with actual real-world latency, right? So it comes down to, those actual users launching applications and seeing how long it actually takes them to do work. So Login VSI does a phenomenal job of measuring that latency and then coming up with sort of a maximum capacity. And again, the real key to this is that it's not some sort of synthetic benchmark. It really does execute the applications and take a view and give you a value based on what that sort of user's perspective is. So it can be very accurate. I'm not sure, Nick, have you guys used Login VSI to sort of look at any growth or any changes formally, or are you still kind of relying on the user test scenario?
No, we're actually using a different third-party product called VM Turbo to gauge our environment as to how much we can load it up before we need to add more host RAM or computer storage needs. We're actually using something different.
Yeah, and that tool actually works well for lots of different VMs. So hey, I'm sure that's probably another webinar at some point. But here, just to kind of dive into some of the systems that we tested on, right? So in this case, we actually took what had been previously published by several actual other vendors as a few reference architectures, actually a Cisco UCS V240 M2 server. And these are pretty beefy boxes, but what we actually did as part of our testing, right, is that we actually ran through Login VSI the exact same runs sort of with and without FPP enabled, right? And so what we did in this case is we actually accelerated with RAM, and we dedicated 128 gigs of RAM for this purpose, and that actually probably is a little bit over-provisioned based on what we found in our testing. But that, that roughly comes out to about 850 megs per desktop in this case. But what you can actually see in this case is that we ran the tests, and it's a pretty dramatic difference. Without FPP there, we actually see storage latency start to creep up, and eventually that turns into user latency within the applications themselves, and so we end up with a VSI max score of about 181 users. With FPP here in the mix, though, we saw 298. Which is pretty amazing. Now, the other really cool thing that I can tell you too is that based on some of this data, we're always looking to enhance the product. So we took some of the data we found as part of the certification process, went back to our engineering teams, and actually in the latest release of FPP, you actually now saw, again, not making any changes, the ability to now run 328 users. So that's pretty compelling. Nick, you guys were, we tested in this case with DFTM. That's, for those that don't know, stands for distributed fault-tolerant memory, but it's basically using RAM as an acceleration resource. Nick, you guys are using that in your XenDesktop environment too, aren't you?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, so it's a real easy way to even to be able to accelerate desktops without maybe making a flash purchase, as an example, right? So again, that one of the key things to reiterate to you is that FBP really is it's a software product, right? So you're not having to go out and buy additional hardware, that kind of thing each time. And you can get started with memory that's in the server. I think even, Nick, you guys, you didn't purchase any extra memory. You had enough available in your existing servers, right?
Yeah, that was actually one of the compelling reasons we went with FVP, was that we didn't have to, let me backtrack a little bit. So all of our servers sit about 100 miles from where I sleep in a hardened AT&T colo, which doesn't, have easy accessibility to it without us taking an hour-and-a-half drive or paying, the remote hand service $100 an hour in order to install flash devices for us. So it was very easy to POC FVP, as we were able to do it from the couch, basically, with just, doing everything remotely, vMotion all the VMs off, install the driver, vMotion all the VMs back on, configure FVP, and we were done. The whole process probably took about 30 minutes or so. But, for us, being a small business, it was compelling that we were able to utilize resources we already owned and not have to incur, any extra, outlay of expenses to purchase PCIe flash cards or SSD drives. We were able to use what we already had. And Andy, this is probably a good interjection here. With the version of FVP that came out yesterday, version 2.5, there's actually memory compression technology that allows up to 4 times the amount of RAM to be available, virtually, as you do physically have allocated to FVP. So if you were to, with the RAM compression now, if you're able to allocate 24 gigabytes of RAM on a host, you could effectively get almost 96 gigs of RAM use out of your FVP cluster with the new memory compression technology.
So you saw that release announcement then, Nick. I imagine that's something you've possibly been waiting for, or hopefully it wasn't. Hopefully someone told you about it before we did, and you have been anxiously awaiting. I definitely think it's one of those things you'll be able to utilize in an environment I imagine you're pretty excited about.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Who doesn't want 4 times the amount of RAM available for free?
Exactly. No, it makes it really nice. And again, right, that really does sort of extend the value proposition here, right? And even beyond just having to purchase, but like you said, all the other incremental costs that start to add up, whether it's remote hands or whatever it may be, if you have a remote data center. So no, it's definitely, I appreciate you pointing that out. Memory compression definitely is one of those things that's it's going to even take the product even further. So, kind of talking about it, it's a perfect way to kind of segue into sizing here, right? Because one of the key things we really start to think about in desktops is, on the Citrix side, whether we have static or dynamic desktops, right? How do we actually do the sizing so that we're not using as much resources as we may need, right? We want to protect that precious memory resource that we have, or flash if we put it in the host as well, right? So certainly one of the key things to do are to follow kind of the best practices for user data separation, right? That kind of thing. The thing to remember when we are sizing resources, though, is that when it is a static desktop, right, then that desktop is whatever's actually recently accessed or written within that desktop is actually what's going to be loaded into the FTP layer in that case. So that'll be unique per desktop usage, right? The really cool thing, though, is that, again, it is self-learning, right? That's not something that you have to go configure or know anything about, right? Literally, we're talking about, setting a policy for that virtual desktop, or maybe, even better for VDI at the data store level, right? So we can say, okay, we want to accelerate reads or reads and writes at a data store level, and then when MCS or whatever else is actually spinning up those new desktops, they'll automatically be accelerated. And again, self-learning there, right? So as those desktops boot up and users start to use their apps, then we'll load that data into Flash or RAM, so it's there for them next time they do that. The other thing, though, to really point out in terms of sizing is what we can actually do with dynamic, right? And again, we certainly want to have that user data separation. Now, one of the things we kind of put in parentheses here, and I'll specifically point it out and maybe throw it over to you, Nick, to talk a little bit about your environment, but it's the fact that, we're definitely talking about desktops today and XenDesktop, that kind of thing, but FVP is not a point solution for VDI, right? We can accelerate any virtual machines actually running in the environment, And that's kind of why we made sure to kind of put this in parentheses, right? We want to accelerate those file servers too, right? So in the case where we may have that user data separation, if it does exist on a server, then we can actually have that profile data, that user data pull up even faster. I think you guys are doing that. You certainly, I think, Nick, are using FTP for more than just your desktops. You're accelerating some of your server infrastructure as well, right?
Oh yeah, so to touch on the point again that we're a small business, we basically have to get the most bang for our buck for every purchase we make. So there are a lot of other products on the market that will accelerate your VDI environment, and they may cost more, they may cost less, whatever you can negotiate with the vendor. But it was important to me that I find a product that not only accelerated VDI, but also accelerated my other workloads as well: SQL, Exchange, file servers, Linux VMs, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of what makes Pernix unique, is that it's able to do not only your VDI environment, but any VM you're able to load into vSphere. It's really, you get the most value for the product as you ever could. And jumping ahead to version 2.5, which was released yesterday, is that the new IO profiling feature, will actually look at your VMs and say, hey, you're accelerating this VM with Pernix. However, we're not really able to do much for it since it's this particular kind of workload, or it's doing this or that, or et cetera, et cetera. It will actually recommend that, this VM not be accelerated with FVP, and it's better served by maybe just using storage directly. So there again, you're not throwing resources and RAM at a VM that is not going to help to be accelerated by FVP. It's really going to help you look at your workloads and say, hey, I can help you with VMA, but I can't help you with VMB. VMB is, VMB, that sounds weird, is fine where it is, just, directly accessing local storage, as opposed to, the cluster in the RAM or the PCIe flash or SSD, wherever that flash media resides.
Yeah, no, that you're exactly right with that profiling, Nick. And in fact, one of the really neat things in the release with profiling is we can actually take that a little bit further even than just at the VM level. And because, as an example, let's just take a server workload, right? That IO profile may be different at different times of the day, same way we see with desktops. Maybe they're back running or something else. So even beyond just at the VM level, right, we can actually detect when that kind of happens, right, and when those workload patterns change, and give you the option to be able to actually accelerate the VM when it makes sense, but maybe not, for example, pollute flash area or RAM area with data that's being pulled down by maybe like an in-guest backup agent or some type of virus scan, as an example, right? So that again, we can kind of take it even a step further with that intelligent IO profiling. So again, it makes it pretty nice. So we talked about sizing and that kind of thing, and I wanted to very specifically dive into dynamic sizing in particular with machine creation services in this case, because there's one very important feature that we're able to actually do in this environment. And the neat thing about it, again, right, you mentioned earlier, Nick, not overspend where you don't need to, right? Efficient use of those resources. So what's really neat in this case is that, in terms of images in the environment, right, if there are multiple provisioned desktops by MCS that actually access the same master image, we'll only actually load that data into the RAM or flash area once for each of those. And so it makes it, not only is the compression very efficient that Nick mentioned earlier, but just by default, when you actually use this method of deployment for dynamic desktops, right, it's going to be much, much more efficient, right? So as you can see here, right, as each of the VMs actually come up, then any of the new data that they create that's unique will also be added to the flash or the RAM area. But again, only the data from the original master image will be populated. One of the cool things there too is that, as you can imagine, right, the first time I were to boot that master image, and maybe this is even as part of the provisioning process, right, and I start to load up some of the blocks for the actual OS, right, they're already going to be loaded when I go to boot each subsequent VM. So, that actual boot time tends to be very fast. Did you guys experience anything like that in your environment, Nick? I know, in particular, I've seen in a lot of our Citrix deployments where, sort of speeding up the user data for the logins really helps, and then, even sort of rebooting that kind of thing, the VMs just come up so much faster because the OS blocks, as an example, right, are already loaded into the flash or RAM area.
Oh yes, most definitely. Yeah, we definitely accelerate our profile, our server that holds all of our user profiles, so they get faster profile load times. But accelerating all of the VDI VMs as well. I mean, we get reboots now in probably 15 seconds, whereas before they used to take almost 60. We're able to update our catalogs in the middle of the day without affecting anyone. I mean, before we had to schedule all of our catalog updates after hours because it just used to thrash the disk, if you will. Trying to update, 200 VMs or so in the middle of the day. So yeah, no, accelerating the, VM, the master image, the gold image, if you will, along with all of those link cones, definitely, takes a toll on your storage, which FVP is able to eliminate.
Yeah, no, great. Couldn't have said it better myself. You're exactly right. So that's great that you're seeing sort of some of the same benefits that we saw as part of our testing, and that we've seen in other customers as well. So now, I want to talk a little bit about data protection in this case, and this actually kind of comes up because we didn't dive into it very much early on, but one of the key benefits, I think Nick kind of alluded to it a little bit before, and that what we actually see in a lot, or not necessarily a lot, but around kind of the industry, is the ability to sort of create a simple cache for VM. And really, one of the things that separates FVP from the pack, if you will, is the ability to not only accelerate reads and cache reads, but actually create a write buffer and accelerate writes as well. And so, we would refer to that as write-back mode in the case where we accelerate both reads and writes. Now, one important thing, and maybe one of the reasons why there aren't others in the industry really doing this yet, is that can be kind of complicated to really think about because we need to protect the data, right? So, one easy way I really like to think about it is that as a write comes in from, let's take a desktop VM as an example, right, then what we'll actually do is intercept that at the hypervisor layer, and we'll immediately acknowledge back to the guest operating system. So now the actual desktop thinks that block of data has been written to the backend disk in a very low latency way. Again, right? Remember, we're right in the host, so we don't have to travel the storage fabric. But that means we also need to protect that data until it actually ends up on the array. And that becomes very important for things like server workloads, that kind of thing, right, where that data is persistent, right? But what about for dynamic desktops, right? So, if I'm recreating that desktop or redirecting a user to another desktop, if I were to lose a host or a flash device or something like that, right, then I don't really care about protecting it, right? And so that's a very important thing, and that's, again, kind of to talk about the granularity that we allow with FVP, what we actually enable you to do. And I think, Nick, I think you guys do this, right, where what you can actually do is set a write-back +1 policy or write-back +2 policy, where we're actually replicating that write-back data to protect server workloads. But then for dynamic desktops, you can actually set write-back +0, right, where you're actually not replicating, and therefore you get that ultra low latency, provided by, in your case, I think like that local RAM, right? That's something you guys are leveraging today, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the great thing about FVP is that it's not an all or nothing product. You're able to make things as micro or as macro as you want. So for instance, on the LUN that we use that runs all of our VDI workloads, we have that LUN set in FVP to do write-back +0. So any new VMs that XenDesktop creates through machine creation services, which is the technology we're utilizing, is automatically going to be added to that write-back +0 policy. You don't have to remember to go back and add that VM. You don't have to remember to make any modifications, et cetera, et cetera. However, for your server workloads, you probably want to put that in write-back +1 or write-back +2, depending upon what your vMotion network or your dedicated FVP network looks like. So since you guys are leveraging the vMotion network or an FVP network to distribute the writes to make sure they're safe amongst multiple hosts in case of a host failure, if you have a small 1 gig network, maybe you want to do write-back +1. If you have a large network, you may want to do write-back +2. Just depends on your flavor. But the great thing about it is that you're able to capitalize on that at either a micro level or a macro level, depending upon how your environment's configured.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So, it's allowing you to set those policies again, even for new desktops that maybe are spun up, right? So, a typical deployment would be, something where if I'm using MCS, I may point it to a particular volume right? And I may set that volume within FTP to have a write back plus 0 policy again, right? But then my other volumes may be, as an example, where storefront or director or something else actually running, right, those other server infrastructure VMs, right? That's where we can actually protect those with write back plus 1. And that, I kind of flipped over the slide here because, it is sort of a good lead in there, right? And again, we've already talked about it a little bit, but, the fact that, again, FTP is not a point product just for the desktops, right? We're talking about being able to accelerate all of the servers or all of the virtual machine servers, right, that are actually in the environment. So this can actually be the VDI infrastructure in this case, right, which makes it really nice. I know Nick talked about it a little bit earlier, actually accelerating maybe like the file servers where the user data is actually located, and that's a great example. But it's the same kind of thing where if you're not having to go out and purchase new storage dedicated just for VDI, right, then you probably already have server workloads that are running on that storage infrastructure. So the ability to actually sort of decouple performance there, right, and offload sort of reads and writes, that kind of thing from the back end, means that every virtual machine in the environment now is much faster. And Nick, have you guys seen a noticeable improvement even kind of in your server workloads?
Yeah, sub-millisecond latency. Yeah, I would call that noticeable.
Yeah, no, absolutely right, and that's not at all uncommon, right? Once we can sort of do that sort of decoupling, right, and we have not only just sort of that read data there for you, right, but also that write back buffer, if you will, right? You're really talking now the sub-millisecond latencies, particularly when you're using things like memory, like you are for your desktops, right?
Absolutely.
So Nick, we've kind of gone through and we talked a little bit about your environment, just kind of giving some examples of where you use the technology. But I did want to also give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more or add anything that maybe we haven't talked about yet. I did sort of throw on here in the bubble here what is kind of my favorite quote. I believe we attribute to you, right? And the best part was that I was able to do the installation from my couch. I love that one. You want to talk a little more about your environment? Anything maybe you haven't mentioned yet?
Yeah, so like I said, we've been running XenDesktop for a number of years now. Really, before a lot of people jumped on the VDI bandwagon, and we didn't have the money for that dedicated VDI infrastructure as VMware suggests. VMware really wants dedicated compute, networking, and storage. But if you don't have the money for that, you got to make use with the best. You got to make the best use of the resources you have. So, we had gotten the compute under control. We had gotten the network under control. We had the remoting protocols down pat with ICA, NetScaler, that type of thing. Really the last piece of the puzzle was when our users were complaining was really the storage spikes. So, we used to see spikes anywhere from like 200 to 500. And, probably like every other XenDesktop admin that's on this call, gets that dreaded phone call or help desk ticket saying, hey, I'm typing on my keyboard and my letters are delayed by 3 seconds or 4 seconds. And, that's really attributable to, one, it could be your QoS on your networking, but if you're on a LAN, that doesn't really apply. Or what happens is that there's so much storage latency that the VDI isn't able to recognize what the endpoint is sending it, and what results is in a poor user experience. I mean, so we used to get these tickets, and we after we dug into it, really knew storage was the problem. And we started looking into accelerating VDI, and we looked at those software products as we talked about, but they required in-guest OS modifications, or they required some type of caching solution or whatever. And while we could fix the VDI environment, it was a one-trick pony. It wasn't going to fix our SQL, our Exchange, our file server. So we really wanted a product that would leverage basically our entire stack from A to Z and could accelerate any VM no matter what, all without having to buy additional hardware, in-guest caching software solutions, et cetera, et cetera. So with just a little bit of RAM from FVP, we were able to, smooth out all those storage latencies to sub-millisecond times, and our users are just fantastic. I mean, they feel like they have their physical desktops back. And if you're going to go look at the hyper-converged infrastructure solutions, hey, that's fine. Those are all, major forklift upgrades, though. And if you want to look at an all-flash array, hey, by all means, go for it. They all start in the $100,000 plus price ranges, and unless you have 40 gig networking, 10 gig networking already in place, you're going to be going through a network upgrade as well. So for us, we really wanted to solve the problem at hand utilizing resources we already owned, without having to go for our throats per se. And FVP really just fit the bill for all of the things in our list.
Yeah, great. Yeah, definitely. No, we see it, day in and day out here at PernixData, and it's great. It's sort of with pride that we love sort of being able to enable folks like Nick to be able to solve those issues and really do it in a phenomenal way that will continue to scale, right? I think that's one important thing, right? I think we can tend to really get sort of involved thinking about coming back and solving existing problems, but I think one of the things that we kind of enable, and Nick, I don't know if you sort of think about this as you kind of grow, but once you kind of jump on the decoupled storage bandwagon here, right? It's always going to be the same. Right now, when you go to purchase more storage, you're doing it for capacity, right, or data services, right? Because you can serve performance at the server side.
Absolutely, yeah. And the great thing about FVP is you don't have to go out and buy 15K drives. You don't have to go out and buy 10,000 RPM drives. We're not telling you to buy more drives. FVP is just saying buy your storage capacity and let us handle the performance. And it's really what they do well. Even if you go buy a $100,000 flash array or you go buy 40 gig networking, you're still never going to be able to transverse the laws of physics with the speed of light, getting your storage data closer to your host unless you put the storage into the host. So the only way to accelerate your storage applications is to get them closer to the host of which the compute requires. So even the all flash array guys are still not going to be able to provide sub-millisecond time because you're still transversing that networking layer.
Yep, exactly right. So that's really the great thing. FVP kind of giving you the best of both worlds, right? You can kind of live in the environment where you do have the benefits of virtualization and shared storage, right? But with the performance of local disk. So that kind of brings us to the end and now closer to the question. So definitely, folks, if you have any questions, definitely take a look. Jump out to the PernixData website, download the software. Right, that's the beauty. Again, it is software. Right, so if you're having a really pressing issue, if you've been getting emails throughout the webinar today from your end users and you have the issue, definitely jump on the website, download the software. We'll be glad to get going with you. So definitely reach out. We have here listed sort of info@PernixData.com. If you want to reach out with any questions, if we bump up towards the end here as well, that's fun. Or give us a ring. Either way, lots of ways to get in touch. Don't be shy. We'd love to help you. So I think with that, Manju, are you back on with us? I think maybe you can take questions.
Yes, Andy. Thank you so much, both of you, Andy and Nick. That was a wonderful presentation and discussion. So we got a couple of questions here. There's some interesting questions as well. So to begin with, I have first question for you, Andy. Can you provide some information on what I should use for acceleration of RAM, PCI Flash, and SSD?
Sure. No, that's actually a great question, right? So I think, and hopefully throughout the presentation we've answered this a little bit already, right? But I think, as Nick mentioned, right, they were able to get started using memory, and that's again a great way to sort of dip your toe in the water with the technology if you want, right? Again, not having to go out and purchase resources. Now, one of the cool things, we didn't talk much about this, Nick, right? But I think it's definitely something you guys probably use. I know a lot of our customers do, but it's sort of analytics that we have built into the product, right? So like if you go in day one and you get started with memory, you're able to see, hey, is this enough memory, right? Maybe now with DFTMZ and compression, right? Does that provide me what I need? Or do I have some server workloads or other things in the environment where maybe Flash is the most appropriate? You want to talk a little bit about that, Nick? Just I think it might be good coming from a customer, some of the analytics and stuff that we provide.
Yeah, so absolutely. So yeah, so when you're going to do your POC of FEP, I strongly recommend everyone start out at the RAM layer if you have some extra RAM to thread it. And you don't need a lot of RAM. 8 gigabytes per host I think is the minimum, Andy, or 4. Correct me if I'm wrong there. But along with the new DTFM-Z feature that came out yesterday, they're going to compress your RAM up to 4 times. So allocating 8 gigs is really going to be like getting 32. You take 32 across 3 hosts, now you have a 96 gig, RAM acceleration tier you can take advantage of. But getting back to the performance charts that Andy was talking about, is that you're going to be able to see on a per VM level exactly how much RAM FEP is going to have to use in order to get the performance out of your VM. And one of the metrics that I wouldn't say I regularly look at, maybe once every few weeks or so, is called an eviction rate. So the eviction rate is once FEP loads your VM into its acceleration tier, you're going to be able to see how quickly those common blocks in that VM are changing, and how quickly FEP is going to have to get rid of those blocks in order to make space for new blocks. So what support recommends is that you don't exceed an eviction rate of 20%. Now, until you start using the product and seeing how long it works and the type of latency, response times, and I/O you're getting, saying that 20% is good or bad is kind of irrelevant at this point. But that's kind of where support wants you to be around as a general rule of thumb. Now, I will say this: if you're looking at doing this for a VDI-only cluster, and you can get the FVP VDI-only edition, that you're going to see those eviction rates are going to be around 1 to 2%. And that is because all your VDIs are all using the same common blocks. So FEP does not need to allocate a large amount of RAM for your 100, 200, 300 VDI VMs in order to get the acceleration you need. It's really important you understand that, because a lot of people will think, oh, I need to go out and get an 800 gig SSD drive. Well, that's not the case. Because of all these common blocks amongst the VDI machines with the link clone technology and vSphere, it's not going to have to evict those common blocks from RAM in order to make room in the RAM tier for new information coming in. So it's really important you start out, with the RAM, see how you're doing, and chances are you'll be able to get fine with just that alone. So I would definitely recommend people don't run out and go buy SSDs or PCIe flash cards just to do a POC of the technology.
Great. Yeah, Manju, did you have some other questions?
Yeah, we do have a few other questions. So the second question is again for you, Andy. So the question is this more of a short-term solution to stress the life of my current storage?
Okay, yeah. Again, some of the questions that probably came in before we talked about them as part of the presentation. But yeah, I'll just reiterate. Right, we talked about this, just a couple minutes ago, and the fact that although you may see that the product, is being able to come in and kind of be your savior, and I think definitely we were somewhat in Nick's case, right? But the fact that once we now have it in place, we can now plan and we can purchase our new storage with that in mind, right? We've now decoupled performance from capacity. So now when we buy more storage, we're really buying it for capacity rather than performance. So, it's both, right? It's not just, some people may say a Band-Aid, if you will, right, to fix, right? It's going to, really show its value, not just in sort of fixing problems, but in that sort of cost savings as well as you go forward after you've decoupled.
You know what's funny, Andy? We had that exact same question in the other webinar we did. Someone asked if it was a short-term solution.
Yeah. Well, it's common, right? Because, I think that's one of the, certainly, right, the folks that have issues, right, are probably looking for a solution, right? So, I think that happens quite a bit. And then, as you kind of learn more about the product and we start to talk about sort of this decoupled architecture, right, you start to think, maybe it's not just a fix for my problem, but maybe a kind of a new way, a new paradigm, if you will, of doing this.
You know what, and I'm going to piggyback on that just a bit. I'm just going to bring up something I said earlier, is that even if you go with an all-flash array and 40 gig networking, you're still not bringing the storage closer to the host where it needs to be. And unfortunately, you're never going to solve the laws of physics. You're never going to solve the speed of light issue. You still have to transverse that networking fabric in order to get to your blocks of data. And unfortunately, do I look at this as a short-term solution? Absolutely not, because unless I can get the storage inside the host where it needs to be, then I'm still going to have this problem, no matter how far down the line I go, no matter how fast my networking is, no matter how fast my storage is. I seriously doubt there's a flash vendor out there who can provide sub-millisecond latency.
Compatible.
Awesome. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah. Yeah, the next question is again for you, Andy. Is your solution compatible with Xen Server?
Good question. So unfortunately, it's not today. So the first product we actually tackled was actually VMware ESX, and so we do plug into the kernel there. And that actually, has more to do with, frankly, kind of our background, right? Is our two founding members, both our CTO and our CEO of the company, actually came over from VMware originally, right? So certainly nothing to be biased against Xen Server as an example, and certainly that's one of the things that we look to put on the roadmap to support all hypervisors hopefully in the future, but unfortunately not today. We do support, though, certainly, XenDesktop and XenApp, running on top of VMware.
Okay, so the next question, I believe Nick can take this question. So, Nick, what VSA workload did you use to test?
I think actually that was probably more targeted for me, Manju, because I think that's sort of part of our testing. And that's actually an easy one to answer. So we just use the standard, kind of industry standard medium workload in that case, right? So it's kind of the, if you're familiar with login VSI and sort of testing and benchmarking, that's kind of the standard, if you will, de facto for most folks that are testing. Although I will say, certainly there are lots of different workloads you can certainly test, and that's available to do. One of which actually is a new product actually from Login VSI, which more stresses storage and that kind of thing. So those are some of the things we're also doing in the background. So definitely look for additional info and sort of white papers, those kind of things that come from us as we do some more testing in the future with different types of workloads.
Hey, Andy, if you don't mind, I just want to jump in on that question, because I'm a XenDesktop admin, much like most of the people on the call are. White papers are white papers, and those environments are set up completely different than your environments. I mean, being that this is a no-break install type of POC you can do without any changes to your XenDesktop environment, your gold images, your link clones, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's really best to test, the product in your environment because your mileage may vary.
No, hey, exactly right. As much as, I hate you discrediting those white papers that I work really hard to publish, and I know Manju probably works really hard on as well. No, I have to exactly reiterate that. You're exactly right. No better way to test, completely non-disruptive. Go out, download the software, and install it. See, take a look at it and see how much faster your VMs boot and how much less latency, and frankly, how much more happy your end users are, right? Really easy.
Thanks, Harry. So I think we do have a couple of more questions. The next question is, if you are in write back +2 when your acceleration layer is in RAM and you have server or persistent video workload, are not you in danger of loss in case of rack or chassis failure?
Great question, actually. And so this is actually something that we've thought about, right? And it's actually built into the product, right? And so certainly, right, RAM is a volatile resource. So no doubt, right? If that server were to lose power or were to go down, I would lose that data, which is why we do actually replicate and give you the choice to replicate it to one or two different host servers. Now, what we also do, and that we haven't really talked about here yet, is we provide a feature called fault domains, where, for example, your cluster, if you were to set it up, maybe with different power feeds, as a good example, right? In the case of VFTM testing, right? What we actually allow you to do is take each of those servers that are maybe in separate racks or have different power feeds and put those in different fault domains, and then that will ensure that we always replicate across, right? So, if I were to potentially lose power on one of the feeds, or someone were to, run a crash card into my server rack and take everything down right in the data center, then I have a much higher chance of being able to hold on to that data in that case, right? So that's exactly well, not exactly, but one of the reasons why we have sort of fault domains built into the product. Another of which is actually the ability to do sort of metro clustering or replicating across WAN links and that kind of thing. But I don't know, Nick, are you using fault domains at all in your environment? I'm not sure.
No, we are not currently. We have everything in one rack at our colo. But much to the case where you said if you had a separate rack with separate power feeds, we most definitely would be doing fault domains.
Yeah, no, and in the cases, right, I think, for you guys, you're using RAM, right, with dynamic desktops, right, so it's not quite as important, right, but yeah, no, definitely like the person that asked the question, right, if you were, accelerating server resources that you needed to protect or static desktops, right, that's where you may potentially want to use fault domains if you're using DFTM or DFTMZ. So, Manju, I think we're getting close to the end here.
I think we can take one last.
Maybe we can take them offline.
Yeah, that's fine. We have one last question. If you want to take it, you can. I think it's a simple question.
Sure. Yeah. If we can fit it in, let's go for it.
Okay, yeah. So, how does Pernix accelerated MCS compare with RAM-based PVS?
No, good question, right? So certainly, I think one of the key differences for us, right, and when you look at the two technologies, and obviously they work in, I won't say necessarily a similar way, but they're certainly both using memory in this case, right? And so the difference really is at the layer in which we do it. And so certainly in the case of FEP, we're actually going to do the acceleration kind of at the storage layer, right, in the back end. Rather than the app layer that then you would configure as part of your XenApp deployment. Nick, are you guys solely XenDesktop, or are you using XenApp at all?
No, we're using XenDesktop strictly, but we did look at using PVS, so I can speak a little bit to this. So if you're an MCS shop, you're going to have to spin up PVS servers, and there is a document by Citrix that will walk you through moving your MCS deployment into a PVS type deployment with, setting up Pixie booting and setting, the server and the PVS caching and all that other stuff. And that will help your VDI, to a certain extent, get you moving along faster. But it will do nothing for your SQL loads, your Exchange loads, things of that nature, whereas Pernix does. So when we were looking at, making a change, we said, well, we can either go the PVS route and just get a little bit of help, or we could go the Pernix route and get all the help we ever need. So that was the reason why we went down the Pernix route with FEP in order to get acceleration for all of our workloads. While VDI does represent a majority of our workload, it's not the only workload that needed help.
Sure. Yeah, and that's the case, right? It's really about targeting, whatever particular use case or workload is. So Manju, I think we're probably right up against time. Do we have any other time for more questions, or
So we don't have any questions as of now. Probably, in case if you receive any, we will, send it across to you, and you can directly get in touch with the attendees. How does it sound?
Yeah. No, that's phenomenal. Thanks so much for the time today, Manju, and thanks, Nick, for joining us as well.
Yeah,
no problem.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Andy. So with that said, we are about to end today's webinar. Thank you all for joining today's webinar in the Citrix Ready Technical Webinar Series. This concludes our broadcast. Thank you.
Thank you.